Danny does a great job with the fire department. He knows the history extremely well, and he puts up with me. Yes, that deserves a whole applause. I want to thank the Historical Society for the opportunity to do the research and to give these presentations. History and writing are a passion of mine, and it has been wonderful to have these opportunities. I also want to thank Grace Lutheran Church for making Grace Hall available, and a big thank you to Pastors Matt and Cody, Ronnie Wentz, and Chaplain Jan Mickey for all their hospitality. I also want to make sure that I acknowledge what a pleasure it is to work with my elected official colleagues, Mayor Dr. Mona Becker, Tony Cavacci, Dan Huff, Ann Gilbert, and Greg Pecoraro. These folks have worked hard to prioritize public safety in the community, and their hard work has made a great difference in our community. But a special thank you to the members of the fire service, especially the Westminster Fire Department, who have spent hours and hours and hours sharing with me the intricacies of the training and the highly complex technical science of firefighting and much of the history. I'm the chaplain and the PIO for the fire department. I am a support personnel for the firefighters and the EMS providers. They don't want me running into burning buildings. And finally, a huge acknowledgement to Caroline Babylon, whose tireless support and editing and advice has made this presentation possible. So where to begin? I should probably begin with the year 2023. The Westminster Fire Department will celebrate its 200th anniversary of serving Westminster and the greater Carroll County community. During this exceptional year in the department's history, many events will occur for the public to learn about the vital services of the volunteer fire department. The culminating event will be October the 7th, 2023, and that's when we will have an antique fire muster at the firehouse with a parade through downtown Westminster. The Westminster Fire Department currently responds to over 7,000 emergency incidents every year. Do the math, that's a lot of incidents. We provide these services from 3 medic units, 3 fire engines, multiple support vehicles, and a new $1.3 million ladder truck. And I would be remiss if I didn't also recognize former Council President Suzanne Albert. It's great to see you here. Suzanne's been a good friend and a good supporter for many years and a big help with this. And I should also say something to Lee Magnuson. You had a great presentation on the distillery building last week, and I really appreciate it. So what I wanted to do with this is 200 years of the fire department. That's a lot to squeeze in 45 minutes, it really is. So what I really wanted to do was highlight some of the history, some of the structure of the department, some of the key incidents that we have responded to over the years. Every fire has a social and economic, a psychological impact on the community, but there are certain fires that have had a profound impact upon our history and have changed the history of the community. So I wanted to highlight them, and then I wanted to highlight a couple of the persons, of the folks that, some of the leadership that has brought the fire department forward for all these years. And then I wanted to quickly mention that this is an assemblage from multiple sources. I've tried to credit folks when I can credit them, but this presentation is for educational purposes, and I wanted folks to take that into consideration when you look at some of the pictures. To start off with, without public safety, you cannot have community. Since the dawn of history, folks have come together to form communities primarily for the purpose of public safety. This communal necessity is primal. We are wired to come together for safety. And I don't want to get off script that often because I'll go over, but the city of Westminster was formed in 1764 for a specific reason. That was the end of the French and Indian War. That's why there has always been an emphasis in Carroll County and in Westminster on public safety, because Carroll County was not considered safe until the end of the French and Indian War. To get us started, I have a couple of slides from the annual Blue Mass that's held at St. John Catholic Church. I thought that they were priceless. This year the service was held on October the 2nd, 2022. The Catholic Church has always been very good about recognizing first responders. Father Mark Bielik has just done a wonderful job of support for the chaplains in the fire service in our community and the police department. Fortunately, Westminster has had a very rich firefighting heritage and tradition. We've been blessed with many generations of extraordinary citizens who step up to the plate to do the hours and hours of training and volunteer their time to the community, and a selfless dedication and a commitment to our safety. And there's no better time for me to remind everyone that fire prevention is everyone's business. Don't think it cannot happen to you, it can. Throughout the history of the city of Westminster, there have been a series of disastrous historic fires. From the fire in 1834 on Goose Pond Lane, and I went, who knows where Goose Pond Lane is located in Westminster? It's still there. Chris, you know.
Liberty Street.
Liberty Street. Liberty Street. So there was a fire in 1834 on Goose Pond Lane, which helped change history, to the disastrous fire on April the 9th, 1883, when an entire square block of the city of Westminster from John Street to Carroll Street was completely destroyed, including where it is that we are right now. This church was completely destroyed. Fire companies from as far away as Baltimore responded to that fire. The April 6th, 1906 Palace Livery Stable fire next to the firehouse then on Main Street burned to the ground. And that fire is significant because the Westminster City offices burned in that fire. On April the 12th, there was a fire. April the 12th, 1924, there was a fire at the Farmers Fertilizer and Feed Company warehouse at the intersection of Main and Liberty Street and the railroad tracks. And this fire threatened the rest of the block. It was only stopped by the heroic efforts of the Westminster firefighters. The first mention of a fire department in the city of Westminster was in the year 1808, and that's when the Maryland General Assembly passed an act authorizing a lottery in the city of Westminster to raise money to pay for a fire engine. That lottery was also to help pay for the Union Meeting House that was located at the time in the Westminster Cemetery. The first mention of an organized fire department was in the year 1823. That organization was called the Union Fire Company of the town of Westminster. And throughout the history of the city of Westminster, there's an emphasis on the word union. And that's because we now have this concept of the city being this one big metropolitan area, and it was never that way. The city of Westminster is the combination, the amalgamation of as many as 9 villages, 9 totally separate different villages that all came together. The first incorporation on February the 5th, 1819 is when 5 different villages came together to form the city of Westminster. The first building for the fire, the first fire station, so to speak, was located on Church Street. It was erected in 1823. It was a plain board house built with 2 large doors, no windows, and a shingle roof. In those days, Westminster only extended from what we now understand to be Center Street to Washington Road. That was at the dividing line between Baltimore and Frederick County. Another interesting tidbit about the history of the Westminster Fire Department is that when The second firehouse was established at the intersection of Court Street and Main Street. It also served as the town jail and a drunk tank. In other words, when a town drunk was picked up, the local authorities would move the firefighting apparatus out of the firehouse and lock up the offender inside. Remember, at this time, Westminster had only incorporated in 1819, and it was still in Frederick County, and a county jail had not been built in Westminster, so they used the firehouse as the county jail. The next part here, we want to talk about the period between 1834 and 1866. This was a period of enormous economic and social unrest in our country, and it was also a period of great unrest in the city of Westminster and in Carroll County. This was the period of time in which one of the worst depressions in the history of the United States took place, the Depression in 1837. Everyone wants to talk about the Depression of the 1930s. The Depression of the 1930s was romper room compared to the Depression of 1837. It was absolutely horrific. To set this up, we have to go back to the 1700s. The first iron furnace believed to have been erected in the United States was located a short distance from what we have later understood to be Avondale Station on the Western Maryland Railroad. It's about 3 miles outside of Westminster. The hilly range east of the furnace was known as Furnace Hill. It was in this area that charcoal burning occasionally took place. On one occasion in 1834, the woods caught fire. The Union Fire Company responded and traveled up the street, down Goose Pond Lane, and down to the farm owned by Mr. Jacob Meyerly. Upon arrival, the firefighters were asked, "What are you going to do with the fire engine?" They replied that they were going to put out the fire on Furnace Hill. They were asked, "Where are you going to get water?" Realizing there was no water for the pump, they let the fire engine stand and ran to the hill and put out the fire by hand. To the dismay of the Westminster Mayor and Common Council, after the fire, they simply left the fire engine behind. They left it there for weeks before it was brought back to town for fire protection. In 1851, the Westminster Mayor and Council had enough. They ordered the old engine and the firehouse sold. It was by the efforts of Colonel James M. Shellman and others that the fire company was reorganized and permitted to go on to 1857. For additional context, please understand that some of the worst riots in the history of the United States took place in this time period. They were the Know-Nothing riots. In Baltimore, the Know-Nothing riot in the fall of 1856 in Baltimore was led by firefighters. This was followed by the name of one of my favorite events in history, the New York Dead Rabbits riot of 1857. So this is the context behind the fact that in 1857, the City Council sold the fire engine. They sold it to Michael Bachman, who later became mayor of the city of Westminster. Michael Bachman's had a blacksmithing shop where Amy's Laundromat is now located, there at Bishop Street. And Michael Bachman was an interesting character during the Civil War. Michael Bachman used the iron and he sold the copper. The wheels were used for one of the many tanneries that were in town. After the sale of the fire engine, the council ordered hooks and ladders, thinking that would be less fun for the firefighters and a little more protection for the citizens. So this leads us up to February 1st. Yeah, this is a great slide. I like this slide. It really gives you a good idea of what the city of Westminster looked like. Yeah, this is taken from College Hill. You could study this picture for hours. In 1868, the town was still growing west. An effort was made to start a hook and ladder company in the west end of town, but objection was raised by some of the older citizens and the project was abandoned. After several more disastrous fires, the old department was reorganized on New Year's night, 1879. Land was purchased at 37 East Main Street, and the department was incorporated in February 1879. And the name given by the court was the Westminster Fire Engine and Hose Company No. 1. And then I've always hypothecated that this is where Mathers is currently located, where the old fire station was located. Some talked of an injunction to stop the organization, but the firefighters were recruited from among the most solid businessmen in town. And this is a tradition that continues to this day. The fire company, the fire service in Carroll County has some of the most prominent, successful men and women in Carroll County, and has always served us extremely well. Back in 1879, the department had 50 active members. The first purchases were a Holloway hook and ladder truck, a Holloway chemical engine, and 4 chemical extinguishers. Keep in mind that the town water system wasn't completed at this point in time. The town water system was not completed until 1885, at which time the pumper was sold and the hose carts took its place. I think these are amazing pictures from this time period. And I don't know where I got them, but that shows, and it obviously shows the building before the tower was put on top of it and the bell. So next we want to go to the Great Carroll County fire, Great Carroll County Jail fire. This stereograph shows Carroll County's old jail in Westminster as it appeared following the fire of May 1882, which gutted the interior. According to historian Mary Ann Ashcroft, I should have given her a shout out. Where is she located? Oh, okay. According to Mary Ann Ashcroft, around 1838, about a year after the jail was completed, a 17-foot high wall was erected. It was 2 foot thick to enclose the jail yard, and you can see that in this picture. In 1874, a gallows was erected in one corner of the yard, and according to Judge Joe Getty, the wall was demolished in 1912 when a major jail improvement project was completed. So that brings us up to the Great Westminster Fire, the Jacob Thompson's Livery Stable Fire. Tragedy struck in Westminster on April the 9th, 1883, when Jacob Thompson's Livery Stable, which was on the alley behind West Main Street at the corner of John Street, went up in flames. 4 men were playing cards in one of the carriages in the livery stable. They were using a candle. They set the candle on one of the seats to provide light. A dispute arose when one of the men was accused of cheating. The accused grabbed the money and ran. The other men scuffled before taking off after the man with the money. In the scuffle, the candle was knocked over and it started the fire. When later caught, the men claimed that they didn't know that the fire had started. The fire alarm sounded at 11:30 p.m. By the time the firemen arrived, the stable was fully engulfed and a strong wind was spreading the flames to neighboring structures. Remember, this was in 1883, before the water system was completed in 1885. So the firemen fought the blaze with the chemical engine and water carried from nearby wells. The light of the fire, the Great Westminster Fire, was visible all the way to Gettysburg. The Hanover newspaper, The Spectator, reported the light of the conflagration was so vivid and intense it illuminated the whole of the southwestern sky. By morning, the fire had destroyed 16 houses. It had destroyed Grace Lutheran Church, 2 factories, and 8 stables. 17 families and 13 businesses were left homeless. The total fire damage was estimated at $135,000. 2 men who had been sleeping on the second floor of the stable where the fire began died, as did quite a number of horses and cattle. Yeah, that's a picture of Grace. Well, that's a picture of where the fire started. That's on John Street, and if I'm not mistaken, the brick house is still there. The brick home, the large brick home is still there. And then that's one picture of Grace Lutheran Church that many folks are not familiar with. That's what the church looked like before it burned. So that brings us up to November of 1896. The new fire station at 66 East Main Street. In 1896, the 3-story firehouse located at 66 East Main Street was erected just up the street from the old firehouse, which was subsequently sold. That's a 1903 picture of the 1896 structure. The April 11th, 1896 newspaper, the Democratic Advocate, reported upon the laying of the cornerstone. This was a fascinating event in town. The article is very long. I've tried to reduce it to one paragraph. The event has been anticipated with great interest, not only by firemen, but by the citizens in general. The event drew a great crowd, including many from the surrounding countryside. It was preceded by a parade of the Westminster Municipal Band and the firemen in full dress uniform. The parade was formed at the railroad shortly after 1 o'clock under the charge of the Marshal, former Mayor Joseph D. Brooks, the President of the fire company, Mr. E.J. Lawyer, and the Chief of the Fire Department, F.K. Herr. The parade went through nearly all the streets of the city, and the parade was witnessed by a large number of people. Later in the year, the firefighters arranged for a parade on Thanksgiving Day for the dedication of the town clock, which was located at the top of the building, and the unveiling of a memorial tablet. This took place on Thanksgiving Day, Thursday, November 26, 1896. Which brings us to the 1906, April the 6th, 1906 Palace Livery Stable Fire in Westminster. So built in 1896, I thought this was fascinating. You can study this for a long period of time. This is the list of the officers of the company in 1896. So this brings us up to the Palace Livery Stable Fire. In 1896, the old firehouse on East Main Street dominated Westminster's skyline. If I'm not mistaken, the previous tallest building in Westminster was 1854, and that was the Oddfellows House. And then the firehouse on at 66 East Main was very controversial at the time because it was such a large structure at the time. The size of the structure was certainly indemnified by over the years, but at the time, it was difficult stuff. The building in 1906, the fire department building housed the fire company's equipment on the first floor. The upper floors had meeting rooms, the city council chambers, the city council offices, the city clerk's office, a banquet hall, kitchen, and a lending library. This image here shows the lending library after the fire of April the 6th, 1906. The fire in 1906 pretty much destroyed the Westminster city offices. 22 horses died, 45 vehicles were destroyed. Can you imagine going up that ladder? I mean, I look at that picture. There's another great picture from the cemetery from the back. It's only fitting and appropriate that from time to time we take a moment to remember many of the great Carroll Countyans who have gone before us. For much of the history of the fire company, the leadership of the fire service and the Westminster elected officials were one and the same. As a matter of fact, for much of the history of the fire company, the Westminster Fire Department was the de facto governing body in the city and much of the county. Even when I was a kid, growing up in the 1950s, if you had a problem in the city of Westminster, you didn't call the city offices, you called the fire department. They solved it. As a matter of fact, for many years, for emergency incidents, you called the fire department. The fire department alerted the police. Back in the day, when you needed the services of a police officer, you called them at their house. There's a fun incident in 1958 when I ran away from home on my tricycle, and Mom called Chief Sight. She called the fire station, which called to the attention of Chief Sight, all 6'7", and he came and he found me in front of St. John Catholic Church, and he took me to where they take little boys that run away from home. He took me over to Mayor Matthias's office, and I got hooked from that time on. But we were talking about, where were we? We were talking about John Cunningham. On December the 31st, 1965, John Cunningham passed away within a few hours of his 99th birthday. I remember Mr. Cunningham. He used to walk all through the city of Westminster. He used to bicycle through the city of Westminster. It is reported that he never missed a council meeting for decades, a Westminster City Council meeting for decades. In March 16, 1997, in an article in the Carroll County Times, local historian Jay Graybeal wrote of his rich life, including his interest in bicycling, walking, and poker. At the time of his death, Cunningham was believed to be Western Maryland College's oldest living alumni and the state's only living charter member of the Maryland State Firemen's Association. When he died, he was America's oldest banker and years of continuous service, and he was a lifelong member of the Westminster Fire Department. Next is, for fun, on November the 11th, 1924, there was a leaf fire at Western Maryland College. On Friday evening, November the 11th, 1924, a fire alarm was sounded for a leaf fire at Western Maryland College. I believe I got some of this history from Dr. Leitner. Did I get some of this history from you?
Not that.
Well, there's a great newspaper article about it. Upon the arrival of the fire company, the students notified the fire department that they were not to put out the fire. Chief Schaefer ordered the firemen to put the fire out at once because it was too close to a building. As the firefighters were putting out the fire, the students decided to throw stones at the firefighters. Pro tip, that's not a good idea. One of the stones struck one of the firemen, Harry Coots, in the head, causing the blood to flow freely from his injury. Head wounds bleed like crazy. This angered, I should have put annoyed, that would have been more. This annoyed the members of the fire department, and the students were chased away with a stream of water. And it was reported that a couple of the students were handled a little bit roughly, but no serious harm was done to either. I can't imagine. Next, we want to talk about John H. Mitten. John H. Mitten was a charter member of the Westminster Fire Department. John H. Mitten is one of my serious heroes, and maybe you'll figure out why as we talk a little bit about his life. Along with Benjamin Disraeli, John Mitten is one of my greatest heroes from history. When John Mitten died on September the 4th, 1931, he was still editing the Carroll County Times. He was thought to be the nation's oldest newspaper man. He served for several years on the Westminster Common Council, Mitten was also a charter member of the Westminster Fire Engine and Hose Company number 1 from 1879, and he was a Civil War veteran. He was also, when he passed away, he was also the oldest member of the Westminster Fire Company, and perhaps the only 87-year-old active volunteer firefighter in the state. So when he was a kid, in 1856, he first entered the office of the local newspaper, the Carroll County Democrat, to learn the printing trade, a vocation that proved to be his life work. Pay attention to this next part. On August the 10th, 1862, at the age of 18, he enlisted in Company A of the famed 6th Maryland Regiment of the Union Army. He was in many battles in Virginia and was wounded at the Battle of the Wilderness, May 5th, 1864. He recovered from the wound, served until the close of the war, and was mustered out on June 10th, 1865. The famed Maryland 6th Regiment took a great part of Grant's siege of Richmond and Petersburg, and it was just absolutely horrific. In 1911, when George Mather began the publication of the Carroll County Times, Mr. Mitten accepted a position in the Mather Printing Company. With his wide acquaintances throughout the county and knowledge of newspaper work, this aided greatly in the immediate success of the Carroll County Times. In 1914, when the Times Printing Company was organized, Mr. Mitten was a stockholder and later a director of the company. Now, it seems that in 1923, this is a great picture because this has Leland Jordan in it, and it also has Claude Kimmy in it, and it has Marie Kimmy in it. And this is right across the street from the old fire hall and the Times building. So, and if you could read, can you read the newspaper article? Well, we talked about the fact that Mr. Mitten had fallen ill, and is the letter next, Caroline?
There's the letter.
Great, yeah, the letter. Can you read the letter? I was instructed to inform you that at the annual meeting of the active and honorary members of the Westminster Fire Department held tonight, it was noted that that was the first time since the organization that you were absent from the annual meeting and banquet. Many recalled and spoke of your active and loyal service since the early days of the organization, nearly 40 years ago. A motion was adopted and spread on the minutes testifying the esteem of your fellow members, of your regret at your absence from the annual gathering by reason of sickness. We hope for your speedy recovery at future meetings. Mr. Mitten was held in great esteem in Westminster for many years. We next come upon the July 3rd, 1938 fire at the Ray Snyder Lumber Yard. This was one of the biggest fires in Carroll County history. It occurred on July the 3rd, 1938 at the Ray Snyder Lumber Yard on John Street, ironically where the fire station is currently located. On July the 8th, 1928, a front page article in the Democratic Advocate newspaper conveyed the grave concern of the community over the fire. Westminster citizens had the scare of a lifetime Saturday night when a fire from an incendiary origin was discovered in the lumber yard of Smith and Rafe Snyder. It caused an undetermined loss. The loss was estimated at $125,000. At the time, the company was solely owned by John Rafe Snyder. According to the article, Rafe Snyder fed the firefighters sandwiches and coffee at the American restaurant after the fire was brought under control. The first alarm sounded at 11:45 by the night watchman, John Bale, and all the firefighting equipment owned by the Westminster Volunteer Fire Department responded. Mr. Magnuson. the towers in that picture. That's from 1938. Mr. Magnuson gave a wonderful presentation last week on the history of the distillery building, and we were trying to figure out when the tower was built, and this picture is taken from 1938. I can't imagine citizens roaming around in a fire ground these days, but I've always found that picture to be quite fascinating. The department chief at the time was Leroy Brown, who immediately put in a call for additional help. Firefighters from 16 departments with 19 pieces of apparatus responded from Union Bridge, Hampstead, Manchester, Tawnytown, Pleasant Valley, Sykesville, Emmitsburg, Catonsville, Reisterstown, Owings Mills, Glendon, and Pikesville. I really like this picture. This is the 1933 American Advance Pumper. Oh, yes, sir. Okay, thanks.
Turn your head and hand.
Sure, okay. At the time, so we next come to the State Theater fire in 1965. At the time, the State Theater was located in the Davis Building at the corner of John Street and Main Street. The Davis Building and the building next door to the west, where Harry's Lunch was once located, was torn down in the 1970s to straighten out the intersection of Bond, Main, and John Street. Today, this area where Harry's and Left Terrace was located is in the parking lot beside 56 West Main Street, where the Penny's department store was once located. We want to next pay a tribute to another one of my mentors growing up in the city of Westminster, a fellow Marine, past Fire Department President Chief Robert Duvall. Robert Duvall was a World War II Marine veteran, a small business owner. He was a welder. He taught me welding, and an avid motorcyclist. He did not teach me to ride a motorcycle. He was a 1939 graduate of Westminster High School. During World War II, he served in the 3rd Marines in the South Pacific. He was at Iwo Jima, Guam, and Peleliu, to mention a few of the horrific battles in which he took place. He was the owner of the Mobile Welding Service, which was founded in 1948. He was the 11th state certified welder in the state of Maryland. Mom really appreciated him because I spent an awful lot of time with him. I would pop in the truck and we would go out to all his various different welding jobs in town. But he was just really, really neat people. When he passed away, we put his casket up on one of the pieces of fire equipment, and we took it over to the cemetery, which was only a fitting and appropriate service to Mr. Duvall. The last picture is Caroline's dad. And this picture by George Welty in the 1970s. This is a picture of Mr. Babylon, who is handling a hose with an unknown firefighter from the 1970s. We hypothecate that Caroline is a 4th generation member of the fire department. I'm a 2nd generation, but Caroline is a 4th generation member of the fire company. I could go on for a long time, but that concludes my remarks for today. Now you get to play one of my favorite things about these presentations, Stump the Historian. Oh, I like this picture. I like this picture a lot. What's the next one? Yeah, that's the front page. I remember that fire. Keep calm and ask me questions. Ask me questions. The more questions, the better.
We have a microphone questions.
Oh, come on.
Testing. Somebody.
Danny, did I get it right? We're good? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I'll warm us up. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York. It was a Martin Scorsese
movie. Maybe you wouldn't have to see it. But the fire companies in New York, and I know it's not really related here, but maybe there's some relevance. They were much more that they were almost like groups or like places to hang out or gangs, or early on was it that way, or is that just a New York thing, or how realistic is that?
The fire department has always played there's always been a social component to the fire company. You know, which we're a close-knit family. We stick together. We depend on each other in very difficult circumstances, in the middle of the night and in dangerous situations. And that shared common experience, not unlike the Marine Corps, not unlike being a police officer. Police officers and firefighters are all part of a family. We're all very close. If you score high enough on the test, you can become a firefighter. There's no police officers in here. That's more fun when there's a police officer. I'm also the chaplain with the Maryland State Police, so I can always throw that in a little bit. We have to have that was an awful lot of history and a lot of trivia. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, well, my goodness, I learned so much today, Kevin. I mean, unbelievable stuff. I just didn't know. And I'm certainly going to look into 6 and 8 North Church Street.
That's where I've always thought. That's where I've always thought the first firehouse was located.
So we can find that out with our library. We can nail that down. And I'd love to. And what's interesting to me is Mittens lived in my house.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I forgot that.
I would love to see if John Mitten lived next door, or
Yeah.
I would find that really interesting. And then my last little comment, apropos nothing, is that you were lucky to know Mr. Duvall, because I don't know if people realize how brutal the fighting at Carroll was.
It was horrible.
I mean, men entered in flat beach into machine guns.
Yeah, literally.
And the survivability of that was almost zero. To have anyone live through that was amazing. So you were a lucky boy.
And he talked a little bit about it. He was one of the reasons why I went into the Marine Corps. He talked a little bit about it. Mr. Sensity would talk about it a little bit. He was in the war in Europe. And we always have, I learned from one of our lieutenants at the fire station, a lot of the folks from World War II and Vietnam, they don't talk about the war. But it's important that we constantly talk about these incidents. I tend to not talk about things with people who aren't firefighters and police officers, but yeah, it was horrible. And it was also horrible what Mr. Mitten went through with the Maryland 6th Regiment. That campaign was just horrific. History's been very kind to General Grant. I have no idea why. I just simply don't. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk about when the fire department's little museum is open now, that we could go see some of the old equipment? I haven't been there in years.
Yeah, and the Fire Museum is a great treasure in our community. I took that part out in deference to time, but it's a real treasure, the fire department museum there in town. But I don't know the hours. Danny, what are the hours?
There are no set hours, and anyone can stop in if someone's in the station. I'll be glad to take the tour. One of our pieces is currently in pieces because it's being restored. But there are no set.
I've been in the fire station before in which people have shown up and they wanted to go through the library. And we're always more than happy to give people tours of the library. If you haven't been there, it's absolutely wonderful. It's a real treasure.
Yes, me.
Yes, ma'am.
My dad was a fireman in Baltimore County in the Headville Fire Department. And one of the things I remember as a kid growing up, and I'm wondering if you have the same kinds of memories, was to be taken to the fire department, introduced to all the other firemen, placed up on the big seat of the fire truck, and actually to ring a bell, the big bell on the front of the truck that said we were coming. Do you have a memory like that?
My uncle Wilbur Megan, Wilbur Wright was a member of the fire department, and from time to time when Mom wanted me to be entertained, she would send me over to the fire department. I'm sure I was an enormous help. I can only imagine. But yeah, Wilbur Wright had a special place in my heart. He was always very kind to me and always very supportive. And I looked up to him at the fire department. I have extremely fond memories of stopping by the old station.
Do you have any memories of the Dalmatian dogs that used to travel with the fire department on vacation?
Chief was actually one of the Dalmatians was named Chief, and Chief. It's a wonderful presentation. Maybe I ought to come back at some point in time and talk about all the ordinances and all the challenges in the city of Westminster with loose hogs, dogs, chickens, cattle drives. One of the last cattle drives went through Westminster in 1922. So there was an ordinance that dogs had to be held on a leash at all times in the city of Westminster. And of course, Chief was a nipper. The reason, does anyone know why we have Dalmatians? Why is it that Dalmatians are associated? Yes, sir.
Historically and in Europe, Dalmatians were used to guard the horses in the stables. And you'll see many an old photograph of royalty in their carriages being followed by the Dalmatian dogs. So the dogs were there kind of to guard the horses. Is that correct?
What he said was, yes. What he said was the Dalmatians were guards for the horses at the time. They were also known as nippers, and they would nip at the heels of the horses to keep them moving along as quickly as possible to the fire. So we had Chief. His name was Chief. The dog's name was Chief. And Chief was the subject of some attention because Chief was off of a leash. So the Westminster Mayor and Common Council made Chief an honorary person, an honorary citizen in the city of Westminster, so Chief could go roam about town as Chief pleased.
He had a spotty reputation.
Kevin,
What's that?
Kevin, when I was growing up in Westminster, young, I had two brothers that was in the fire department, and in them days, a lot of them would be at work and they'd have their equipment in the trunk of the car. And when the fire siren would go off, they would give out a certain signal. 2 whistles for a certain area, and then I wondered if you could elaborate on that somewhat, if you knew anything of that.
Not only that, what's really interesting, that's a wonderful topic that didn't make it to the presentation. I kind of wish it had. That's the yellow light. So in the day, up until about sugar shoot, 1966, would you say, Danny? Up until about 1966, if you had a fire or a police emergency, you called the fire hall. If it required the response from a police officer, the fire station would turn on a yellow light that was located above Main Street in front of the fire hall, and that was an indication that the police officer needed to go into the fire station and find out what was the nature of the emergency. But yeah, we had different tones for where the fire was located, and people were aware of the. And we had the one siren. We had the one siren there on Main Street, and then there was another one on the east side of town at Malcolm Drive. Danny, did we have another one on the west end?
Yes, your main Union Street.
Okay.
And when the firefighters heard the siren, instead of going to the firehouse, they would respond with their own car
Yeah, exactly. And also, when the fire alarm went off, all the firemen would just show up in their cars and they would clog Main Street in front of the fire hall. And there were folks that were assigned to park the cars out of the way. Dr. Leitner?
And when that siren went off up on outside of Alumni Hall, it was always when we had something going on in there.
Oh, but of course.
They playing. You get to a very quiet moment, and then the siren would go off.
Mr.
You
President.
didn't mention the Guild Gymnasium fire. That would be later, but that
Yeah.
had to be the great biggest fire in town. It drew 50 pieces. I understand. For
Yes,
hours.
yes, very much so. That was, and wasn't that another cold night? Was that one of the cold night fires? There were,
January 1.
yeah, there were a series.
Foggy, very foggy.
There were, yeah, it was very foggy. There were a series of fires in the city of Westminster that took place on extremely cold nights. One was Vermont Federal, where Popeyes is currently located. That was supposedly, according to folklore, I mean, the water was freezing almost as soon as it came out of the hose. The other one was the Shipley House there at the corner of Main and Center Street. Extremely cold night. And the Guild Gymnasium fire, which was a huge fire.
New Year's Day, that was huge.
Huge fire. Mr. President, you had something?
I just wanted to comment on the siren. What Mr. Bloom is referring to is the siren, they're known as blasts, but the siren goes, the tone goes up and down. So depending on the location in town of fire, determine how many blasts. That way the members knew which end of town to respond to. In our museum, we actually have a wooden box that has metal wheels in it. And when the call would go into the station, they'd insert that wheel into the siren control, and it would control how many blasts of the siren. And up on the second floor, we actually have it's like a postage frame that identifies what blasts are identified on each end of town. So here's that. That's before pagers and cell phones, and that's how the number of blasts will determine where in town the call is located.
And while we're waiting for the uniform, a lot of these traditions started before we had the telephone. It was in great common use.
So I know we're coming up on a big anniversary. Maybe Danny wants to share with us what activities are happening with the...
I think that would be a really good idea. That would make me happy. Yeah, because Danny's done a great job. Dr. Bangard has been a big help with that. The 200th anniversary committee has done a wonderful job, and this would be a great opportunity to share that.
The largest event that we currently have, Kevin's already mentioned, that's our fire muster on October 7th. Muster is a gathering of antique equipment, so we're going to have a large parade. We already have, I believe, between 40 to 50 pieces registered, and it's a year out, so that we're really tickled with that. It'll be a large parade that follows a normal parade route through Westminster, except it'll end at the station. Parking lots with cooperation of the city parking lots that surround the station will hopefully be full with antique fire apparatus, and we'll have several events that are still in the planning stages for that day. So it'll be a fun day to come out and learn about not only the history of the fire department, but to learn about the other folks that have antique equipment that will come out to that event. And then there'll be smaller events throughout the year. We usually have an open house. We'll have some more events scattered throughout the year as well.
And I should take this...
For a sunny day next October 7th.
October 7th next year. And I should mention that Danny's dad, Fred Plunkard, and Danny have been a great part of putting this together. I should mention that Dr. Tim Bangard and Joe Ebal typed all of the minutes of the Westminster Fire Department back, I don't know how far back. And they are a wonderful, but they transcribed all of the minutes and they're now available. The beginnings of this presentation started many years ago. I don't know how many. I've written hundreds of articles about the fire service. But when I first started doing the research, well, I have a lot of papers in town from Uncle Wilbur, from Mom, and I have a lot of access to a lot of papers from the Babylon family. But Caroline sat down and for hours retyped into the computer old newspaper articles, hours and hours. So we have them to thank for this. Joe Eball has been a big help. Fred Plunker's been a big help. A lot of the older firefighters, I can't thank them enough. Yes, ma'am?
Kevin, one question. I remember in family, or my family, grew up in northern Baltimore County, that my grandfather was among a lot of people that went down to help fight the Baltimore fire.
Mm-hmm.
How far did the Westminster Fire Department travel? I know you noted that a number of companies from Baltimore County came up here. How far would the company be able to travel over the years?
I meant to reread some of the history of the Baltimore fire. Didn't we send equipment down there? We sent it down by train.
Westminster sent 2 of the 5. Another member just shared with me yesterday a newspaper article that he located. Westminster sent 2 of our 5 postcards, which is just a 2-wheel. Kevin has several pictures of them in his presentation, I believe. It's just a cart with a big reel of hose on it. We sent 2 of them, as well as Union Bridge sent 1 down. They were put on a train car. It was a 50-mile, it took them 50 minutes to get to wherever they went in Baltimore City. And there's the article is rather lengthy. It goes to describe the efforts of some of the named buildings that the firefighters from Westminster actually saved during that great Baltimore fire in 1904. In our station, once again, we have some limited pictures of that fire, and we have a letter from the city of the mayor of the city of Baltimore,
right,
thanking us for our response to that event.
And Baltimore came up for the Great Westminster Fire in 1883. And then recently we lost 3 firefighters in the city of Baltimore. And what a lot of people are not aware is that many of the volunteers in the city of Westminster are also paid firefighters in other parts of the state. We have a number of firefighters who live in the city of Westminster. As a matter of fact, it's a great opportunity to share one piece of trivia that a lot of folks are not aware. Carroll County has the largest percentage of emergency responders as per population of any county in the Mid-Atlantic region. Because, again, why? Because of our emphasis on safety. If you're a firefighter or you're a police officer and you're in Montgomery County, you're in Northern Virginia, you're in Baltimore, and you're at work for 24 hours, your family is safe in Carroll County. We look after our own. One of my good friends was involved in an incident a number of years ago in which he was flown. He called the code for a police officer in trouble, and he said police officers and firefighters showed up from agencies he had never heard of before that live in the city of Westminster. We look after ourselves. The other interesting tidbit about the Westminster Fire Department is that for many years we were the Carroll County Fire Department. We responded to, if you read the history of the great fires in Sykesville and Manchester and the Cambridge rubber fire in Tonytown, Westminster was the primary responder for many of these events. We traveled all over the county at the time.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question?
One,
Then Kevin, wait a minute.
one here then.
Kevin, do you have a number as to how many from the Westminster Department went to the 9/11 Twin Tower?
Oh, I don't know that. Danny might know that. Danny, you have an answer? How many of our folks went to the 9/11 events?
None of our
All right.
Fire,
Any
res-
other questions? Go ahead.
fire responses are very choreographed. They're very organized. I'm amazed at the science and the engineering that goes into fires. I think the general public would be amazed of how many airline pilots we've had as members of the Westminster Fire Department because of the emphasis on engineering and the science behind. And I respond to as many of the fires as I can, and it's fascinating to be with the command staff as they go through all of the science, the training, the technicalities, the complexity of fighting a fire. And we lose, I think last year throughout the nation, we lost something like 387 firefighters that died fighting fires. It was a large number. Yes, sir?
To add to the 200th anniversary, the slide up on the screen now is the Christmas ornament that we put together. It's going to be a series of 4. This was the first one. That features the station in 66 East Main with the 2-wheel hose cart that was built in 1897, I'm sorry. And the next one is a 4-wheel hose cart, which features a hose cart built in 1898. They're both available now. By early November, we should have this year's tournament, which features the ladder truck, the 1924 city service truck that's in our museum. We're really tickled with that. It looks exactly like the truck that we have. And then next year, the final of 4 will be the 1933 engine that's in our museum. So anybody interested in that, you can purchase one or a set of 4 from the station or contact Kevin. He can get you in contact with if you're interested in that.
Wonderful. That sounds absolutely great.
I think we have one more.
All right.
Kevin, how many
Yes.
female firefighters do you have, and when were they first admitted?
How many firefighters?
Female.
No, I still didn't hear it.
Female.
Women. How many women?
Ladies.
How many women? We have quite a number of women firefighters.
Dan said you have 30.
I'm guessing probably 30.
Yeah.
Probably 30.
Women play a very key and critical role in the fire service these days. They're excellent firefighters. They're excellent EMS providers. Caroline is the treasurer of the department. She keeps us all straight. But women play a very key and critical role, not only in the fire service, but in the police department. And we're very proud of that.
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. Let's give him a big round of applause. Wonderful presentation. Thank you very, very much.
Thank
And
you. Thank you
remember,
for having me.
Next